You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Thanks for joining me as usual, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing very well. I'm looking forward to revisiting something on the podcast that I've been wanting to talk about for a few weeks, actually. So, as some listeners might be aware, the U.S. Department of Defense has, I believe, for a few years now, been releasing an annual report to Congress on Chinese military developments. Effectively, it's a nice, unclassified look at the balance of power in East Asia, focusing specifically on Chinese military capabilities. I find this report to be quite useful, even though it doesn't include the full gamut of cutting-edge developments in Chinese military capabilities. It does offer a very good high-level glimpse at where things are going in China with the PLA. And the PLA is still undergoing a major process of reform that was initiated by Xi Jinping in 2015. But this document does a very good job of talking about every branch of the People's Liberation Army, China's overall strategy. It gives special attention to the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait, one of the likely contingencies for a military conflict in East Asia today, and it focuses on the South China Sea as well, which we'll talk a bit about. And in this year's report in particular, there's some very interesting developments on the nuclear front. So with that said, let's get right to it, Prashant. I just want to, spend this podcast maybe just talking a bit about some of the impressions and takeaways that we had from this report. So for you, what's your like top line takeaway here? I mean, I think it's actually quite similar to recent years in many ways at the top line, right? It's very much focused on Chinese conventional capabilities, even though there are very interesting findings on the nuclear side. But what's your kind of 30,000-foot takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me is, as you noted, this is something that's an annual report. So really, the chief sort of takeaways that you get are usually in terms of, what really has changed from previous iterations of the report, because most of it is sort of general lines of continuity. And then secondly, when the report is released, what does the overall U.S.-China relationship look like at that particular time, particularly the military-to-military relationship? And I think on both those counts, we really have seen some significant developments under the Trump administration. And in that respect, I mean, in this era of so-called strategic competition between the United States and China that is evident in the national security strategy and subsequent statements that were being given by the administration, one of the things that comes through very clearly in the report, this iteration of the report, is the very comprehensive and sort of almost hybridization of Chinese capabilities across the board, right? So there was particular sort of mention about, for example, things like One Belt, One Road, and how China is using its sort of economic pillars of its strategy in the foreign policy realm to extend into the defense realm as well. And even with respect to the South China Sea, there was a notion that the Chinese are leveraging a whole range of capabilities, not just on the military side, but economically, diplomatically, politically, to bring to bear pressure and what the report calls low-level coercion against some of these other claimants in the South China Sea. So I found that for this report, really the main focus was on the fact that the Chinese are really thinking very comprehensively and sort of in a very integrated way in terms of how they're leveraging their military assets and capabilities.
Right. I think that's all apt. And on the point of discontinuities and changes, this year's report does acknowledge, of course, the United States national security strategy and national defense strategy, both of which were released after the 2017 iteration of the China report came out. And we should also note that this year's report was actually quite late. It came out in August. In previous years, the reports have been released in either April or May. So I thought that was a bit notable. I still haven't figured out why it was delayed, but it probably was just held up bureaucratically at the Pentagon for a bit. I'll just talk a bit about some of the things that stood out to me. I did a short piece about this at the Diplomat, so if readers are interested, I'll drop a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But a lot of the developments that really caught my attention were actually on the nuclear side. So there's actually a really big revelation that just sort of popped into this report and sort of came out of nowhere. We didn't see it in the DNI's Worldwide Threat Assessment or the recent testimony by the chief of the DIA earlier this year, but apparently the People's Liberation Army Air Force once again officially has a nuclear mission. So a lot of our listeners might have assumed that China is a triad power, that it has nuclear delivery capabilities at air, land, and sea, but that actually wasn't true, and hasn't been true since we think the 1980s, when the Chinese Air Force was phased out of a nuclear mission. They used to have gravity bombs, and they stopped operating those after a while. But now the PLAAF has a new nuclear mission. We don't know exactly what capability gives it that
Hmm.
nuclear mission. So that there's a few things that I've reported to Diplomat, for example, a new air launched ballistic missile, but that hasn't seen deployment yet. It's still in the experimental and developmental phase. That's going to be deployed by the mid 2020s. And that, yes, that would be a nuclear capability delivered from an experimental variant of the H-6K strategic bomber. But my best hunch is that this capability that the DoD report talks about as giving the PLAF a nuclear mission is probably the CJ-20 air-launched cruise missile. That's been hinted to have a nuclear capability in previous U.S. government documents. So that's the most likely candidate in my view. But that I thought was an interesting development. So China now, I guess, is a triad power. They still have 4 ballistic missile submarines operational, according to this year's report. That was confirmed in last year's report. I think for the first time that these SSBNs were operational, and they likely operate just out of Henan Island, out of the Yulin submarine base down there, operating JL-2 submarine launched ballistic missiles. So yeah, all that was quite interesting. The other development, I think for the first time we have confirmation in an unclassified document that the DF-41, China's newest intercontinental range ballistic missile with multiple warhead capabilities, is potentially being based in silos and possibly even being based on rail cars. So that's interesting. I'm not sure the reasoning behind that, but possibly it has to do with difficulties building the road mobile launchers that the DF-41 is supposed to be deployed on. The DF-41 still hasn't been publicized in a Chinese military parade, so there are a few sort of pictures that float out there on the on Weibo and a few Chinese networks claiming to catch the DF-41 in the wild, but China hasn't officially yet revealed this weapon to the world. What jumped out to you, Prashant, about the Belt and Road component of this? Because I agree with you that that was actually quite interesting to see. There's a big special section on it, and specifically notes that China intends to use the BRI to develop strong economic ties with other countries, shape their interests to align with China's, and deter confrontation or criticism of China's approach to sensitive issues. And it goes on to note that some BRI investments could create potential military advantages for China, and there's no surprise that that's long been a underlying sensitivity about the Belt and Road in some of the countries that are more skeptical about the endeavor, including, let's say, India and possibly even Japan, and the United States certainly. But what's your takeaway about the Belt and Road from this
Yeah.
report?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting takeaway there is the report specifically mentioned that the Belt and Road Initiative was part of this sort of I think the word that was used was a sort of shaping strategy or initiative by China to sort of use a full range of tools, economic, diplomatic, political, in order to leverage that into defense or security related outcomes, whether it's South China Sea or sort of other realms. And the implication being that we should pay attention to this initiative not just as something that's purely economic in terms of infrastructure development, but as part of a coordinated Chinese strategy to influence relationships between key countries in the Asia Pacific. So we've seen that with the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. We've seen that with respect to how Myanmar is dealing with some of these investments. We've seen that with Malaysia. So really across the board, there is this notion, I think, that's highlighted in this report that we shouldn't just think about One Belt and One Road as an economic initiative. We should think about it as a strategic initiative, which kind of, I think, dovetails with one of the major points that it's also trying to raise, which is that we should really think about how the Chinese use power more comprehensively than sort of separating out into the defense realms and the economic and the political. It really is sort of an integrated fashion, the way that they're using these capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I think the other thing that's interesting to note is, I mean, with respect to timing, which you mentioned, I think that's really important because that is something that folks in Washington pay attention to. And one of the sort of debates and discussions that were going on here as to why this was so late was whether the administration did not want a release of the report to get in the way of some of the other things that they were doing in terms of their Asia policy. So Mattis was scheduled to make his visit and did make his visit eventually to China, which was a significant visit, first one since 2014, I believe, by a U.S. official um, of that seniority. And then subsequently, the administration was also trying to unveil its sort of Indo-Pacific strategy, and it didn't want that to be caught up in this notion of sort of the sort of China threat narrative that the Chinese have in response to this report and in other fora as well, being keen to highlight that the United States and the Trump administration is really highlighting this notion of a China threat which countries in the region don't share. So this report, the eventual release date came after Mattis's trip to China, and it also came after Pompeo's unveiling of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was initially done here at the Chamber of Commerce, and then his trip to the region, which kind of, I guess, addresses some of the notions that we've been hearing from the region as well. Some of these countries have been wary that the sort of Indo-Pacific strategy is too tethered to U.S.-China policy,
Hmm.
and that it has a very security or military bent. And so you did see the administration kind of unveil these more economic and diplomatic aspects of that before sort of going on this so-called China offensive, even though the report itself was ready months in advance.
Right. No, I think that's a good way to maybe rationalize the decision to delay the release. I mean, it's a bit strange because with I guess with the Mattis trip, right? I mean, right before that trip, actually, DoD was very publicly
Hmm.
poking China at a variety of forums, including the Shangri-La dialogue. It really started to become a bit of a name and shame game. But I guess there are limits to how much you want to name and shame China, and this document is quite descriptive, right? So this document doesn't particularly deal with the implications of the Indo-Pacific strategy, or actually say what the United States is doing in response, but it does highlight and draw attention to China's military modernization capabilities. To go back real quickly to the Belt and Road issue, I'd say, another thing that jumps out in this report is that you're absolutely right that the Belt and Road is portrayed as a strategic initiative here, which I think it is, that's the correct way to think about the Belt and Road Initiative. It is a nebulous and large initiative. We don't know the precise number of countries that are even participating, or what projects fall into the ambit of the initiative and what projects don't, and what projects are older projects that have been rebranded. Incidentally, September 2018 does mark the 5-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. And actually, on that note, just for a brief segue, our new magazine just dropped. So if listeners are interested, Nadej Roland has a really good 5-year retrospective on the Belt and Road, specifically looking at its implications in Europe. But going back to the report for a second, it is, one of the themes in these DoD reports for the past 2 to 3 years has been the PLA's growing expeditionary and global role. And that's been something that China's been quite open about since the release of the 2015 white paper on defense, which outlined a maritime first strategy that would really see the PLAN become a global navy. And capabilities have lagged behind those ambitions in China, certainly. China just launched its second aircraft carrier, its first indigenously built aircraft carrier. So now it operates a 2-carrier fleet. And the report continues to highlight the People's Liberation Army Navy and Air Force activities beyond the first island chain to the Western Pacific. That's certainly been a significant component of the PLA's activities there, and something that the United States has been watching quite closely. It does play an important part in a Taiwan Strait contingency as well. But going back to the Belt and Road, we do see a discussion in this report of China's overseas base, specifically the one in Djibouti, which is the PLA's only overseas base still, although there are expectations that they might set up new bases elsewhere. There were rumors earlier this year of a base in Vanuatu that the government denied, and more recently murmurs about a base at Manus Island on Papua New Guinea's territory. But both those territories, what they have in common is they provide excellent access to logistics and resupply in the Western Pacific. But what's interesting is the report also notes that the BRI sort of feeds into this expeditionary ambition that the PLA has, because I'll just read right here. It says the growth of China's global economic footprint makes its interests increasingly vulnerable to international and regional turmoil. This, in turn, leads the PLA to have to address those threats. So basically, this kind of feeds in. It's sort of the American story of, you grow a global economic, you're so vulnerable to global economic networks that's when you start to step in and begin actually caring more about the global commons, except in the Chinese case, it's not exactly supporting things like freedom of navigation, or at least not in the way that the United States sees it. So that I thought was an interesting point to underline here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the wording in the report suggested that, these should be thought of as a network of logistics hubs for China's military to eventually project power across the region and then eventually globally as well. And I do think, that the other thing that you briefly mentioned that's important for us to keep in mind, because this is a annual report where the narrative is quite continuous, right? In terms of, China's military capabilities are growing. There's sort of a more comprehensive and clear notion of strategy, and some of that is right. I mean, I think if you look at some of the commentary that's coming out from China, some of it is traditional criticism in terms of the United States and how it sort of hypes up this China threat narrative. But what I found interesting this time around was, and this was evident last year as well, some of the commentary coming back from China, including from Global Times, actually emphasized the fact that, yeah, I mean, China is a increasingly global power, and China will develop its capabilities. And really, the main sort of opposition was around the fact that the United States and other great powers have done this. Why can't China do it? And then secondly, if why is the United States complaining so much, but other regional states aren't complaining as nearly as much by the United States? I think you might have some issues and you might quibble with that a little bit. But I do think the Chinese response is interesting in the sense that they are speaking more openly and honestly about what they're doing, even though they sort of deny the U.S. hyping of the military threat. The other aspect of that that's interesting is, I mean, some of the aspects of the report do hype up some of the elements of Chinese military capabilities and also conceal a little bit some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, right? I mean, those are mentioned in the report as they are in terms of the standard terminology. But this notion that the Chinese military is moving towards a greater notion of jointness and that the Chinese are thinking comprehensively in terms of military planning. I mean, analysts have been pointing out for years that even as we sort of point at these linear increases in Chinese capabilities, we should be really wary about how the Chinese think about doctrine and warfighting, and that might actually, as you pointed out, lag the actual technology and the equipment that the Chinese have.
Right, right. No, I think that's absolutely right. On the openness, I think it's been especially clear under Xi Jinping, right? I think the 90th anniversary of the PLA in 2016, I think that event especially made that clear, right? You had Xi in military fatigues as commander-in-chief of the PLA, a new title that he bestowed on himself, of course, inspecting the Chinese military. And this was a really sort of bald-faced, open show of the fact that the PLA was a powerful military and it would operate increasingly globally. All right, so just before we wrap up today, there's a few other, I guess, bits and bobs that I wanted to sort of drop for listeners that might be interested. So the first thing is this report, I believe, for the first time, addresses the 1961 China-North Korea Treaty, which has been an issue of interest, especially in 2017 when a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula appeared a little bit more plausible than most people would like. That was a major concern, the conditions under which China would seek to intervene. And the DoD report interestingly notes that it's unclear, which I think is accurate, and I think just shows that the United States has reason to believe that there are conditions under which China would not come to North Korea's assistance. And the best guess about what those conditions are is that a scenario where North Korea is sort of seen as the instigator of a conflict or uses its nuclear weapons first or anything like that. The other issue, if listeners recall the Doklam standoff between India and China, which was really hot last year but has since kind of faded. The DoD report notes that China still maintains a heightened military presence in the surrounding region. So that standoff ended specifically the eyeball to eyeball encounter between Chinese and Indian military forces, but effectively the PLA has sort of entrenched itself around the Doklam Plateau, and on the Doklam Plateau you can actually go see this if you take a glance at the Google Earth imagery. There's just a ton of structures and tents and vehicles and pathways that weren't there just a little over a year ago. So that's sort of the fallout of the Doklam issue, I guess, there. And the other issue is on missile defense. China's indigenous missile defense efforts are still continuing, the report finds, which is obviously unsurprising. There was a test earlier this year of a mid-course hit-to-kill interceptor that the Chinese are expecting to deploy pretty soon, I think, the DN3 it's called. So I expect we might hear more about that next year. And the United States is also supposed to release its own missile defense review, which, as far as I hear, should come out sometime in the next few weeks, although I've been told that earlier this year, so we'll have to just see. Anything else to add, Prashant?
I think just one note, which is the mention of China's maritime militia, which made its debut in last year's report. There is a more sort of explicit and detailed accounting of how the Chinese have used the maritime militia in terms of their vast array of capabilities in regions like the South China Sea and other maritime domains. So I thought, I mean, that is particularly significant because I think it shows gradually, as you noted, I mean, this report is about also what the DoD says publicly and is willing to classify, declassify as sort of unclassified information and what it sort of keeps secret. The fact that the Pentagon is speaking more openly about the maritime militia really, even though it lags the years of analysis that has been done on the maritime militia, really signals the fact that they are worrying about this so-called, as I mentioned, low intensity coercion that the Chinese are placing on countries that are rivaling claimants in the South China Sea. So I thought that was particularly interesting, and I expect that you'll see a lot more of that in subsequent reports as well, as the DoD gets bolder about what it says about the maritime domain.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so to our listeners, so thanks as always for listening to the podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe to keep up with future episodes. And if you have been a subscriber but you haven't left us a review yet on either iTunes or Google Play, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.